Welcome to Character in Action with Matthew J. Norcross, the official podcast of the 7 Degrees of Change Foundation. Come journey with us on the real-life stories of character in action. And now here's your host, Matthew J. Norcross.
If you're wondering what a true Phoenix is, you're going to hear one right now. His name is Robby Dilmore, and he's been a radio host and podcaster for over 18 years on the Truth Network, and he joins us right now. Robby Dilmore, thank you for joining me.
Oh, I'm so excited to be with you, and to actually be on this show.
Yeah, I'm excited that you're on. So, you're on the show today because you're a living example of character in action. And before we get started, can you please tell our listeners more about yourself?
Oh, I'd love to. So I was a car dealer for about 40 years until God called me into the radio business by crashing my automobile business into smithereens and kind of coming into the ashes. And so I came out of the ashes of a career to the Phoenix in the radio business. It's quite a story.
Yeah, it is quite a story. It really is quite a story. And speaking of stories, can you tell us a story of witnessing either in person or in history? Someone that was a true Phoenix, someone that was a role model, leading by example and making the world a better place?
What I thought would be fun, since, a lot of what you guys do with Phoenix, right, is deal with people with autism and people with Down syndrome and those kind of things. And so, as you may know, I taught special needs at Calvary Baptist Day School for over 20 years. What you don't know is the funny story. However, how I learned some of the character traits you guys teach through the Phoenix, through this experience from me. So I was a teacher at Calvary. I taught high school. And one day, one of the teachers of the largest Sunday school class at Calvary came to me. It was the Ham Sunday School class, had a membership of about 150, which would have been a real honor, and says, Robby, we've decided we want you to lead the Ham Sunday School class.
Wow.
So I thought, man, how cool. So that's an honor. And I immediately said yes without doing one very important thing, checking with my wife. And so I got home that night and I was like, honey, good news. We are now the teachers of the Ham Sunday School class. And she goes, no, we're not either. I said, what do you mean? She goes, well, Wednesday night, I went to see a program at Calvary where the people were talking about the special needs Sunday school class. And God really told me that that's my ministry. And so we aren't going to teach the Ham Sunday school class. We're going to teach special needs. And I said, you got to be kidding me. Like, what? I've never even met anybody. I don't know anybody. This is out of my, what am I going to do with all my wonderful Bible knowledge? What am I was not very humble.
Wow.
Okay, that's true. And so I have a Christian businessmen's meeting that I go to every Thursday morning, and I actually was there this morning. And back in those days, there was a missionary that used to go to South America a lot, and I told all my friends my story, expecting them to say, Robby, yeah, you need to stand up to your wife and tell her you're going to teach the Ham Sunday School class. Instead, this guy looked at me, this particular missionary, and he looked at me and he said, Robby, under the least of these, my brother.
Wow.
And I went, okay. So I went back, I accepted the rebuke. I went back to my wife, still not humble, still thinking this is crazy. However, I felt like God was trying to teach me something. So I went back and I said, okay, I'll try it for a week. So when I went, these were adults with special needs. And so some of them were in their 30s, 40s, 50s. One guy is as old as me.
Wow.
Okay. But these people scared me because some of them were punching the air and a lot of them were not verbal. And, some of them just seemed scary to me and they were a little out of control. And I was like, man, I'm not at all comfortable with this, Tammy. I don't know what in the world. I mean, here I have all this unbelievable Bible knowledge, what am I going to do with it? Right. And she says, well, just be patient. Will you come back one more week? Because I really feel this is what God wants us to do. So I come back a second week. I'm a little more comfortable. Third week, I'm a little more comfortable. Finally, the teacher of the class comes to me and says, Robby, I hear you're a pretty good teacher. So how about next week you teach the 5th commandment?
5th commandment. Part of the 10 Commandments.
And I said, well, I can't even teach my own kids the fifth commandment. How in the world, which is honor your father and mother, how in the world could I possibly teach that? She said, well, it'd be a good exercise for you. So God had me actually right where he wanted me.
Yep.
Where I had no clue what I was going to do. So I had the only alternative was to pray a lot, right? And so I'm that whole week like, God, what are we going to do? How am I going to teach this? And God humbled me. Like, so you're not so smart, are you, Robby? You haven't got it all figured out, do you? And so what he showed me, actually, he said, well, how do you honor somebody in a way that anybody could understand it? Because if you're going to teach this, you got to teach it at a level anybody can understand, even if they don't speak. Mm-hmm. And so what he showed me was to honor was to get down on one knee. And so I had sort of this little flannelgraph, and I kind of explained parents as best I could and mother and father as best I could. And then I got down on one knee, and people were looking out the window because, with people with autism, you can't necessarily tell if they're paying attention, right? Mm-hmm. And they're punching the air, and a lot of things are going on, but I didn't think a lot of learning was going on, honestly. But then, right, at the end of the class, the parents show up, right? And as the parents show up, guess what? These kids get down on one knee.
Wow.
And then one of the parents goes, what's with that? And Robby taught about the fifth commandment today. Then the tears came because they saw their child had actually learned something that obviously God taught them. Okay, not me. But at that point in time, like, man, I realized what a beautiful, beautiful thing it was that God had given me this opportunity to teach, right? Because I was in the ashes, a very proud person, but God got me down there where he needed me, where I was on my knees, right? Mm-hmm. And right. Taught me how to do that. And with that, right, with that humility, he built my character some so that I would actually spend the next 20 some odd years seeing tremendous biblical understanding in a group of folks that a lot of folks don't realize how beautifully they can worship like nobody else on this planet.
Wow. So how do you define character?
I defined it as Christ likeness. In other words, if you want to know what a real man looks like, take a look at Jesus, right? And from my standpoint, if you really look at his life and you look what he did, but most of all, what he sacrificed, right?
Right.
He talk about humility, talk about grace, talk about a lot of things, and you'll see it in Jesus. But by the same token, he was quite fierce against people's enemies, and yet he couldn't be more kind, right?
Right.
And so when I think about character, here's somebody who is completely trustworthy, but at the same point in time, I know that he's not going to stand for any shenanigans.
Yeah. Jesus won't stand for shenanigans, that's for sure.
He doesn't, right? So,
right.
I mean, that's my idea of character.
Yeah. And it's a very good definition, that's for sure. Now, please share a moment that stands out in your mind, something big or even the slightest gesture that was a transformative Phoenix moment, one where you knew you had a significant impact on an individual's life or on a group of people.
Well, I had cancer when I was in 1996, so whatever year I was, been 41. And I was miraculously healed. That's a Phoenix moment all on its own, but I won't get into that one today because I want to talk about somebody else. Okay. So I ran that dealership in Mocksville, North Carolina. I was a Chrysler dealer, and I had worked with a guy, one of my salesmen by the name of Johnny Hendricks. And Johnny was a good guy, and everybody liked him, but he would never talk about God. And we had a Bible study. One time he even paid to buy our lunch and all this stuff, but he would never come and he would never talk, really. It's pretty surface. You know, you ask him if he's a Christian, he would tell you yes, but you never really sensed he had a real relationship with God. So one day I am working on a lot of things and I'm really, really, really busy. Mm-hmm. And here comes this knock on the door, and Johnny says, Robby, can I talk to you? And he says, Robby, they just diagnosed me with pancreatic cancer, which is not good, okay? But at the time, he was probably coming to me for some real God information. However, I was actually too busy in my mind for him. So I crashed and burned, believe me. As I said, well, Johnny, I'm going to pray for you. I had cancer. You're going to be okay. He needed more than that day. And I saw the look on his face as he left my office, and I hadn't ever forgotten it. To this very minute, I haven't forgotten that look in his face. So about 2 weeks later, I got a call from his wife that Johnny was in a coma. And they didn't know if he was going to make it, and could I come to the hospital? So when I get to the hospital, his best friend is there, his wife, his brothers and sisters are there, and they're like, we don't know that Johnny's going to make it in the next few hours. Robby, we really called you because we knew you'd pray for him. So, realizing this moment that, wow, I never even knew whether or not Johnny even really would be going to heaven, right? And that really was a concern to me because I didn't know if Johnny knew God. And so I asked his wife, I said, Geraldine, do you know, is Johnny a Christian? Would he be in heaven? And she goes, Robby, I really don't know. He got really mad one time at the pastor at Turntine Baptist Church, and he would never go back. So I don't know if he is or not. And his best friend, Bruce Rollins, was here, and I asked Bruce. I said, Bruce, do you know, is Johnny, prepared for this? And Bruce says, Robby, I really don't know. I don't think so. So interestingly, the doctor said, well, only one person can come in because he was in ICU. And she said, Robby, would you come in because I know you'll pray? So I go in there and I prayed with Geraldine. And then I became very emotional and I went out to the place where I meet with God. And I had to drive a little while to get there. And when I got there, I just had a meeting, me and God. And I said, God, I cannot believe I let this, that I went all these years without really doing the most important thing I could have done for Johnny, right? And so I said, God, if you would give Johnny just a little more time, I promise you, I will either introduce you to him or help him to get to know you better.
That's a great story.
And I knew that God was going to be faithful in that. And so the next thing you know, we had come back to the hospital and they're like, I don't know that Johnny's on life support. Maybe we should pull the plug. And I said, guys, I just prayed a lot and I just sense God's going to do something here. Don't pull the plug. Promise me you won't pull the plug. So they didn't pull the plug. The next day I came back to the hospital. They're like, Robby, we really need to pull the plug. I'm like, please. I'm getting more and more assurance from God that you're not supposed to pull the plug. 3 days went by, 4 days went by. The fourth day, Johnny sits up in the bed, I promise you, like nothing happened. And he looks like he's from Davie County. He's got his ball cap on, and he's sitting up in the bed. And I walk in there, and I'm like, oh, my goodness, God, you did your part. Now it's on me, right? I got to do my part. But I didn't even know what to say. I honestly didn't, because Johnny isn't the easiest person to talk to. He's an older guy and kind of gruff. And so I actually went back to that same place, and I said, God, what do I say? What do I do? And God just told me, Robby, Johnny's a car salesman.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's all he needed to tell me, because I'd been a car salesman for 40 years. And I knew something about being a car salesman. So I walked back into the hospital room and I said, Johnny, I made a deal with God. And he said, because any car salesman would ask that,
mm-hmm.
What kind of deal did you make with God, Robby? And I said, well, I made him a deal that if he would give you more time, I would either teach you a little bit more about, I would introduce you to him or help you get to know him better. And Johnny, being a car salesman, knows something car salesmen know. A deal is a deal, right? And so his immediate response was, without hesitation, he said, well, you better get to it.
Mm.
And so for 3 weeks, we went through the Gospel of John. And we did the I am statements. I am the bread of life. I'm this, I am the resurrection we got to, right? And I went and taught him about that. This is about 3 weeks later. And I left the house and I came back the next morning. There was a line of cars out in the front yard.
Wow.
When you see a line of cars in the front yard, it usually is not a good sign. It's usually somebody has passed away, which is what I thought. But when I get in there, instead it's a party, and actually one of my pastor friends is there, and this pastor says to me, Johnny, tell Robby what's happened, right? Mm-hmm. And Johnny says, well, you're not going to believe it, Robby. And I said, okay, tell me, try me. He said, well, when you left yesterday, and you were talking about how Jesus was the resurrection, we were talking about Lazarus, and my sister came in and she put in a Gaither CD in the record player, and the song was 4 days late, but right on time.
Wow.
And I realized that I had been in a coma for 4 days.
Wow.
And realized that I needed to know this person responsible for pulling me out of that deal. And he gave his heart to God. Right? And he called this pastor over to make that situation happen. Now, the rest of that story is Johnny died 2 weeks later. That's true.
Wow. But
he wrote an article in the paper that I have in my office that is remarkable because, what happened there was Johnny became a brother. If you had known Johnny before his conversion and known him after, it was two completely different people. That person afterwards, he could be deep with you. He could talk real with you because he was in Christ, and that had happened. And so what had been one of my worst failures in my whole life, a complete Phoenix moment, God totally resurrected it, but he's the one that did it.
That's a great story. So let's move on to respect. This is a very, very important trait, and sadly, it doesn't really seem to be a real priority these days, especially in the age of, social media, the internet, screen time, and all that. So how do you think we can rekindle the trait of respect today?
In my mind, respect has two key elements to it. Mm-hmm. Number one, humility, right?
Right.
And number two, grace. Because if I'm number one in my own eyes, then you can't be number one. So grace means you're my favorite. Well, you can't be my favorite if I'm my favorite, right?
Right.
And so when you're around true Christian people, in my opinion, they have great respect because you always feel like you're their favorite. You can tell when they're looking at you, you find grace in their eyes because they treat you like like you're their favorite, because they have great respect for you, because they themselves have taken that lower seat at the table. Mm-hmm. So from a point of humility to a point of grace, we see great respect. And so I love that way that you put those two things together.
Humility. Yeah, that's a great way to put it, So let's move on to responsibility. Now, you've been on radio and you've been a podcaster for a long time, and those are big responsibilities. How do you balance those responsibilities as well as your personal and your professional life?
Well, to me, responsibility is very much connected to the idea of faithfulness. Mm-hmm. And so, it's very interesting to me that being faithful from God's standpoint requires that you put the onus on Him, right? And so, to me, if you spend enough time with God, mm-hmm. and you continue to be faithful to Him, He will teach you how to be faithful to what your responsibilities are, what your real responsibilities are, because the challenges with anybody's life is something sounds like a great project, but if God's not in it, I'm really not being faithful, am I? Because apart from me, I can do what? Nothing. Apart from Him, I can do nothing. Right. And so I got to figure out, is He in this? And if He's in it, then I'm all in. If He ain't in it, I need to find a way out.
Yep. I can definitely see where you're going with that. It's very important to think about, that's for sure. So let's move on to fairness. How would you define fairness as a podcaster and a Christian radio host?
That's a good question. Fairness. It's an interesting word because in a lot of ways, it leads to iniquity. And this is how it does, because you'll hear the kids saying, that's not fair. That's not fair. And when I base my worldview on that I'm supposed to get what other people are supposed to get, or that person's supposed to get this because that. So if that's the definition of fairness, then I'm not a big fan. Okay. But if the idea is what God has in mind for fairness, which is that he gave you tremendous talents. He really did. And those talents are way more. I mean, I can listen to you think sometimes, just you blow me away. Okay. You really do. And I'm like, man, those are some great thoughts. I could sit there and go, it's not fair. I don't have that, but it's completely fair because there were other things that you didn't have that your father helped shore up in your life, or your mother. In other words, he puts people around us to make it all come together. But fairness has to do with God's way of meting it out, not mine.
Wow. Yeah, I've never thought of that before, actually. And you mentioned the term equity. And if you think about equity and fairness are pretty similar.
Right.
So let's move on to trustworthiness. My question to you is, how do you expect trustworthiness to be learned by your listeners and by anybody else?
Well, again, from my perspective, trustworthiness is very much connected to faithfulness. Similar word, but trustworthiness means that you can be counted on. And sometimes, in order to be counted on, you have to fail.
Yep.
In other words, if you don't ever risk, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but God is a very risky God. In other words, he gave Robby Dilmore free will. And so by giving me risk, lots and lots and lots of risks, there's times that I haven't been trustworthy, right? Mm-hmm. But by learning from those examples, right, then that he's growing and he's stretching my faith to realize that, man, in order for me to be trustworthy, I've got to lean on something other than my own understanding, right? Because if I lean on my own understanding, we are really going to struggle. And so, part of the idea of trust is it's like a muscle. You got to grow it.
Exactly.
And so for my listeners or my friends or certainly my children, my grandchildren, it's giving them that hard job, just hard enough that it doesn't overwhelm them, but it gives them an idea of what they can and can't do. And by growing their muscles and trustworthy, like you came through with that, boy, I'm really proud of the way you did that job. Like, man, I can't believe the way you shoveled that snow. I mean, it was really good. Mm-hmm. But sometimes they don't come through, and there's the opportunity again to learn. Yep. Because undoubtedly grace fits into the deal, and it's through grace we're saved. Honestly, there we go.
Exactly. So let's move on to caring. Now, you, as a Christian, we know that, God cares for us, right? And caring is a very important trait to learn in the 7 degrees of change. And my question to you is, how do you demonstrate the trait of character through radio, through podcasts, through Christian teachings?
Well, caring to me is a lot to do with being wholehearted. Mm-hmm. Right? The people that you see that live from their heart, not their head. King David was a man that was wholehearted, and so he put everything he had into it. And so if you're going to love well, which has to do with caring, it has to be from the heart. It can't be, something that is a decision process. That has to do with God enlarging your heart. In the 119th Psalm, David said, I will run in the path of your commandments when thou enlargest my heart. Well, that's how you get to care.
Yep. I agree with you 100% on that. And now let's move on to citizenship. What does it mean to you as a radio broadcaster, as a podcaster, as a devout Christian, and as a citizen? What does it mean to you to be a good citizen, actually?
Oh, those are wonderful opportunities always, right? We're in a great country, and we have opportunity to demonstrate our faithfulness to God by being a good citizen, by doing the things that obviously citizens do to be part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Exactly. And now let's move on to empathy. I've mentioned many times before that you have to be empathetic to other people. How do you empathize with people in your business as well as in your personal life?
I would like to close this with this story, which hopefully I can do shortly. One of my students' name was Ryan, and he was autistic. And I'd never seen this before, but he was the nicest kid. He hugged you. He was the sweetest kid you ever saw in your life. I had worked with him for 15 or 20 years before this incident happened. But one day he threw his mom's keys in the closet and locked it in the Sunday school room, and they had to go get a lady that could get the keys to get in the closet to get her keys out. Well, when this lady unlocked that closet, it was like a raging bull. And you know how people get like superhuman strength when they get a dose of adrenaline?
Yep.
Well, he came at that door. He slammed that door like nothing I've ever seen in my life. And he turned and started to charge his mother, which actually scared me. So I stepped in front of him and he threw me down like a rag doll.
Wow.
Like a rag doll. And at that time, I was 6'5", 260 pounds. And he threw me down like it was nothing. And then he charged his mother. And his mother looked at him with empathy. And she said to him, "Does somebody need a hug?" And Ryan melted. He literally stood there and melted into her arms and cried. And if that's not the power of empathy, I've never seen it. I've never forgotten it. And I've often thought, wow, if I had that in that kind of heated moment, that was unbelievably beautiful.
That's amazing. So before we close, please share with us some thoughts on how we can bring character back into our culture.
2 pieces of advice I would share with anybody. Number 1, develop a conversational intimacy with God. You got 2 ears and 1 mouth.
That's why I've been told all the time.
Listen twice as much as you talk in prayer. Number 2, get up an hour early every morning and read the Bible. That word will transform your world. And if you do those 2 things, believe me, we'll all change the world.
Good advice. Robby Dilmore of the Truth Network, thank you for joining me on Character in Action today.